Hello again everyone, I hope you're all keeping well. In this video I'll be speaking with you about yoga. What is yoga? Well, before I get into this, let me tell you what yoga is not. It is not a purely physical exercise. Alright? You know these people that you see carrying their yoga mats under their arms and they're heading off to yoga classes, or so-called yoga classes. What these people are practicing is a very watered down, diluted version of hatha yoga, which is not the only branch of yoga there is. It's just one branch of yogic, philosophical, and spiritual inquiry. Okay? The word yoga itself comes from the Sanskrit, meaning to unify. And it is not only a means and a ways to unify the mind, body, and spirit, but also through the practice of yogic unification, you're also emerging with a unified consciousness, both within yourself, if you want to think of it that way, and without yourself, that is to say, outside of yourself. In real terms, when you get into the deeper concepts that exist, say, in Ashtanga Yoga and many other forms of it, it's a recognition that you are a part of everything that you perceive right now, at least, to be outside of yourself, and that all that is outside of yourself is directly interconnected with you. Okay? Now, why this is necessary is because the world at large now has been infected with this ideology of dualism, dualistic worldviews. Okay? This is part of the reason why the way that yoga has been interpreted in the West especially has been destructive. And this is because it's viewed through this lens, not only of dualism, but materialism as well. People are seeking the material benefits without understanding the metaphysical underpinnings of any given path which they might choose spiritually. Okay? It's all about the results. Nobody wants to go through the process, when the funny thing is that life is all about process. Speaking of dualism, getting back to this, you'll notice that every facet of life today is dualistic. Alright? If we look at politics, there's this dualistic sense in which you have one party or another party, and there are camps, and there are in-groups and out-groups and all this kind of business. It's like you're doing your damnedest to exclude a certain segment of the population. It usually ends up being about half the population. And so you're never going to truly get anywhere, okay, as a nation, as a peoples, as a society, if you are constantly at loggerheads with those who have slightly different points of view. It's not going to happen. Okay? One of the reasons why this is the case, that we live in these dualistic paradigms, is because we have been trained to do this. Okay? We're not trained to recognize the natural differences, whether they are of an ethnic or, as some people term it, a racial way. We're not trained to recognize those types of differences and acknowledge them and respect them, okay? Or have a proper, useful dialogue about what those differences are and the fact that they should be respected. Alright? That's not what's happening. We're not taught to respect people's differing viewpoints. That's also not what's happening. Instead, what happens is that people are becoming, as I pointed out once before in a previous video, unipolar. Okay, they're being unipolarized. What this means is they're taught to buy into either one worldview or another worldview. They are not being taught to integrate different views. Okay, they're not being taught to understand the perspectives of others, which may be different to theirs. And this happens in the political context on the left and on the right. The reason I'm talking about politics here so much is because right now, and this will change over time by the way, politics won't be nearly as important in a few years, okay? But the reason it is at the moment is because it's the primary way in which people are entertaining themselves, shall we say. It is at the forefront of most people's minds. And so, with that being the case, you can't not speak about the political landscape. Okay? It's a very tough thing to do to avoid it altogether. But this notion of creating dialectics is not new. This idea of dividing people, okay, cleaving an entire peoples into two subsets, is something that people who are experts, persons who are experts in manipulating psychologically entire countries are very skilled at. Okay? And so they will never allow for the true practice of yoga to seep in. Why? Because then people would start unifying themselves with others. Then what happens? It creates a direct threat to their power base. You have to understand this. Okay? True knowledge of spirituality and consciousness will never really be allowed to flourish so long as there are people in this world who want to prevent that from happening. And unfortunately, actually, let me say something else here as well. And then I'll come back to what I was going to say. This concept people have of others being powerful, as I just mentioned, that also is an illusion when you drill into that. Okay, their power is an illusion. Now that doesn't mean that they don't have influence. Okay? Whether it's financial influence, whether it's political influence, religious influence, and so on, and I'll get into the religion side of it in a minute. But that in itself is an illusion. They are presenting a certain character, a facade to the world, and because they're experts in presenting themselves as being powerful, people assume and buy into the idea that they are. The reality is that no one really, in a true sense, has power over you. Okay? But it's a fun exercise for them, as sick as it is. It's a fun exercise for them to think of the rest of the world as being nothing more than automatons over whom they can rule. But this is a different conversation entirely, so I don't want to get sidetracked. My point is that yoga is not allowed to proliferate in its truest form because of this. Alright? Because there are people with a vested interest in not seeing the unification of an individual or entire groups. Okay? Because here's the funny thing. When people start unifying in one group, alright, automatically what happens is they're forced to reconcile that notion of unification with exclusion. Then they have to start unifying with the other groups. Okay? An additional problem that prevents the unification of human beings in a proper, true sense. Again, that doesn't mean you don't recognize the difference in people, okay, or the differences in people. But whilst acknowledging them, you are able to then understand that at a deeper level, we all came from the same place. Okay, we all come from the same source. This is the most terrifying knowledge there is out there for these folks who are in power. They don't want this to get out. Because, again, if people started to recognize this, it's like a little bit like that story, the emperor doesn't have any clothes on, right? Because if people started to recognize that they all came from the same source and that they owe each other a necessary respect as life forms, okay, something strange would happen. Not only would they come into their own power, would they become empowered, but the people that are in power would very quickly be defrocked, because they are also just like you, just like me, in terms of where they came from. They came from the same source. And that strips them, here's the weird part of it, it strips them of their power, or their perceived power, let's call it. Okay, they can't misuse it anymore. Okay, the great example I like to give is, we were all children once upon a time, so whenever you see somebody trying to lord it over somebody else, just think of them as a 4-year-old child. Okay? And this automatically, this way of thinking strips those people of any worldly power to dictate to you what you should be doing or how you should be doing it, and so on and so forth. Alright? But there's another part to this, which is religion. Okay? You will notice that every religion today, without exception, has become purely materialistic. Now, you can feel free to disagree with that if you like, but the institutions of religion certainly are all about the materialism. They've been pushing this idea for so long that they've robbed the essence of what not belief but faith is truly supposed to be about. See, faith and belief are two very different things. I don't want to get too much into this, okay, because I want to get back to the conversation about yoga. But faith and belief are not the same thing. Beliefs are things that you just accept as being true, although you don't really know why you believe them to be true. So there's an element of being unconscious involved in that. Okay? Unconscious worship is dangerous. And it's dangerous because it means that you are never aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Okay? This means that you are walking around in this world paralyzed, anesthetized, mentally and spiritually. Okay? And this happens all the time. You see this in people all the time. There are good reasons, to be sure, why a person might hold certain ideas. There are good reasons why a person might have subscribed to a certain belief. All right, or a religion, let's say more properly. Belief would be the wrong word to use. It's just that we use it so often in daily parlance, you know. It's easy to misuse that. But when we are consciously aware of why we hold certain ideas, then we can justify our points of view to others. Okay? That's not what I'm talking about. If somebody is consciously religious or consciously spiritual, that's a different ballgame. But then there's no need for a religious institution in that situation, because that person is already spiritually aware. Okay? But even inside religions, as institutions especially, you have a prevailing materialistic, dogmatic point of view that is shoved down the throats of people. And it doesn't matter whether it's Judaism, whether it's Islam, whether it's Roman Catholicism or any other forms of institutional religion. Doesn't matter. Okay? They are all very, very focused on the material. That is to say, what you can obtain if you buy into their religion. Okay? It's all about what is... It's a way of promoting selfishness. Strange as it is, it's a way of promoting selfishness. For example, if you pray to God, He will give you this, 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 and this. Alright? So it becomes a selfish action. You're doing whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's prayer or anything else, in the hopes of being given something in exchange. It's a business transaction in that instance. Do you see? So there's no depth to it. That's why it's material. Okay? And feel free to explore that yourselves a little bit more and you'll see what I'm getting at. But not only are they materialistic, they're dualistic as well. Okay? They're dualistic in the following sense. Almost in every material religion, without exception, okay, you will find this notion of God and the devil as two diametric opposites. Okay, before you get outraged about what I'm saying here, think about it, please. Too many people don't want to think, okay? They are blind to thinking and understanding. They're blocked off from it. Perhaps because their own spiritual energies are actually blocked. Alright? But the notion of God and the devil. Who created the devil in theological terms? If we're looking at, say, the Abrahamic faiths. Whether it's Islam, Christianity, Judaism, who created the devil? Did the devil just magically pop into existence? No. Inside the stories in biblical canon, God created the devil. So then by implication, and this is a theological discussion that theologians have had for a very long time incidentally, that then means that evil also that is perpetuated in the world in some way, shape or form comes from God. Okay? What's funny is that the people who are in the priest classes in these religions acknowledge that. But they don't tell it to their congregations. Okay? These deep-seated theological discussions which are had, you can't discuss them if you're just a commoner, if you're just a churchgoer, or you're part of the congregation, you're not allowed to. Because then it's blasphemy, see. Okay, then it's blasphemy. And in Islam, of course, in the case of blasphemy, you can be killed. Alright? But see that kind of worldview that sets up that dualistic perspective. That in itself is flawed. Okay? And if I was to tell you that that worldview, where you have God on one side and the devil on the other, is the totally wrong way to look at something, that would shock you. What I'm saying doesn't negate concepts of good and evil or moral right and moral wrong. What it does do, however, is to make you question something fundamental, which is, are these things diametric opposites? Or is it a case where they are the extreme ends of a continuum? Okay? If you're looking at it, and this is where, especially when it comes to deep philosophy, right? Especially Christian philosophy, it actually explains this. That is in fact the case. Good and evil are on a continuum. Alright? And it's the same thing with, for example, order and chaos. And people often automatically link chaos to evil and order to good. But that's not necessarily always the case. Okay? It can get very, very complicated. Because when these people are talking about chaos and order, people that are brainwashed into blind belief, whether it's of a religious nature or a political nature or any other type of nature, when people are brainwashed into this worldview, that is to say the dualistic worldview, they fail to recognize that too much order, especially when it is imposed order, which is the important part, is destructive. Okay? And too much chaos, again, especially imposed chaos, is destructive. Chaos and order exist on a continuum as well. But this is a false dichotomy in the first place. And the reason it's a false dichotomy in the first place is because there is only one order which chaos is a part of, and that is natural order. Okay? In the natural order of things, there must be chaos. They are one and the same thing. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same situation with creation and destruction. We have this weird view. Oh, you've got creation on one side and its opposite is destruction. Sometimes, in fact most times, if not all the time, the act of creation often brings about destruction, and the act of destruction can often lead to creation. They exist on a continuum. Alright? They're not opposites. It's like life and death, as I was explaining in the previous video. These are not opposites. Death is a part of life. Otherwise life would not be. Okay? Why all of this is necessary to know is because the dualistic interpretation of reality was given to you. Okay? It was given to you. You did not wake up one day and come up with it. You see, dualism is directly analogous with, let's call it Satanism proper. Okay? If you look at the sigil of, or which represents the satanic worldview, it is dualistic. What is the sigil that they use in Satanism, either Satanism proper or Levian Satanism or whichever branch of Satanism? And yes, it contains many, and there are intricate links to even branches of Luciferianism to some degree. But what symbol do they use? It's the upside down pentagram. And when it is upside down, the interesting thing that you will notice is that there are 2 points at the top. Okay, there are 2 points at the top, which represents dualism. Okay, and it also represents, on a deeper level, materialism reigning over one's consciousness, the unified consciousness. So in a very real sense, why people need to study yoga in the proper context, in the proper ways, is precisely because of the fact that it is the antidote to the satanic worldview. Okay? It is the antidote to it. It's not the only antidote. There are many ways in which you can unify your own inner consciousness. What I mean by that is that you are conscious in every moment. You are incarnating now. Okay? Each and every time. Instead of being unconscious. That is to say, you're not conscious of what you're doing. And you do things merely out of habits. Okay? Because that's what the dualistic worldview promotes. At the end of the day, the results of it are constant actions which you're performing, which you don't even know why you're performing. You only do it out of habit. Okay, because you've set yourself an unconscious routine. Anything that promotes that, by the way, and I hate to use this as an example, but Islam is a great example of this. Alright? And a lot of people don't see this inside Islam because, well, they don't realize it's a satanic religion. Alright? Just like the institution of Christianity today is. Just like the institution of Judaism today is. Which has transformed itself on the subject of Judaism. There's so many things sometimes to cover. You know, I don't want to miss anything out. But on the subject of institutional Judaism as a religion, it is transmogrified into this bizarre brand of supremacist doctrine. Now, you're not supposed to say that because it can apparently in this day and age get you into all kinds of trouble. You can be accused of anti-Semitism. Alright? Just like by criticizing Islam, and notice that I'm criticizing ideologies here, not peoples. Alright? But just like when you criticize Islam, you become an Islamophobe. If I can definitively prove, which I believe I've done several times, that Islam is actually satanic in nature, How does that make me an Islamophobe if I lay out every single fact around it? It doesn't. That's the simple answer. It really doesn't. But by doing that, what happens is that folks who don't like true information can very easily shut down conversations about that so that nothing truthful can be spoken, which would then expose the exclusivity or the supremacy of any given doctrine, which creates division and not unification. Do you see what I am saying? It's the same thing with this smear of anti-Semitism. Both these things are used as a way to silence people and prevent them from critiquing ideologies. But getting back on point, as I was saying with anti-Semitism and all this nonsense that people, these accusations people throw, what they don't seem to realize is that they are unconsciously defending blind belief without truly or fully understanding what their beliefs are in the first place, because they are unconscious about them. They are not conscious about what they believe, what they ascribe to, anything. Okay? And Christianity doesn't get a free pass. Institutional Christianity has done appalling things, horrifying things. And it continues to this day. So, the fact of the matter is that all these branches, again, of what's called the Abrahamic faiths, really have just become materialism proper. They have become dualistic. They have promoted dualism when at the top tiers of their priesthood, they know damn well what the truths are. And this is to create division, destruction, so on. Okay, but if you go up to somebody and say blind belief is satanic in any of these groups who belong to one of these ideologies, okay, if you go up to them and say blind belief is satanic in nature, that is to say that it is a means and a ways of relegating the spirit to the bottom of the pile, actually being against unification. People look at you like you've lost your mind. And the people who do typically, again, are unconscious about their own nature, their own beliefs, their own psychology. And when I use the term nature here, I'm not talking about their true nature. I'm talking about what they have become, what they are at the moment. Okay, here's the other problem that you face incidentally. It might be that you are an enlightened being who understands much of what I've said about the fact that all human beings come from the same source. Okay, and that this is something that humanity at large has to acknowledge in order to get anywhere in a true and proper sense. But what happens if you come across someone who does not share that perspective and who is willing to kill you for merely having that perspective? That's a tough one for a lot of people, isn't it? Okay? Or it appears to be a tough situation. Because it's very hard, if not near impossible, although not entirely impossible, to espouse ideas of unity with people that are disunited, with people who want to promote disharmony. Okay? Because they're willing to kill for their beliefs. With a person like that, you're never going to convince them in any way, shape, or form to search deeper within themselves. Because they don't want to be conscious. Okay? What do you do with someone who does not want to be conscious? You can't make them. You can't force them to be. All you can do is present the truth in front of them, and then if they still want to kill you and chop your head off, well, they'll do whatever they think they ought to. But if you're a truly spiritually enlightened being, something very interesting happens which prevents that scenario from arising in the first place, and that is that you're able to connect with the essence within that human being. And in a way, you're applying a certain spiritual force to help them to become awake, to become conscious. And it's a painful process for that person, should they go through it. Because then they have to acknowledge that they've done a lot of harm, they've caused a lot of suffering through their blind beliefs. And that state that I'm describing is the state of most of humanity right now, and it's incredibly, for me, it's heartbreaking, if I'm honest. Oftentimes, I find myself very close to tears when I look at the state of our species, what we are doing to each other day in, day out, because we don't have a unified sense of our own consciousness. We don't understand that we are an extension of each other life form. We don't understand any of that. And at some level, it's actually pretty terrifying that we've spent this long, hundreds of thousands of years, in existence, and many of us have still not comprehended this. You know, because the beginnings of empathy and compassion, they come from the inner being, the inner consciousness of who you are. If you want to use the term spirit for it, you can. It's an emanation of the life force. And sadly, so many people have bought into the dualistic worldview, which I would call directly the satanic worldview. Haven't they? Well, this video was supposed to be about yoga, so let's get back to that. As I said, yoga is the antidote to dualism, to Satanism itself as well. It is the antidote to it. Or I should say properly, it's an antidote. It's not the only antidote, as I say. There are many other ways in which one can unify one's consciousness through philosophical inquiry, through meditation. Meditation, that's an interesting one. That's deeply misunderstood as well, because it's interpreted through this dualistic lens. And also because of the onset of materialism as a condition, we have stripped that word of its meaning. To meditate, it can mean 1,000,001 different things. What does it mean? Okay, but the practice of meditation really, ideally, should be about simply being. Understanding that you are. And at the same time that you are not. So you have to learn to hold two differing perspectives in your mind without causing yourself a mental or spiritual injury. Okay? And this is very hard for people because they've been taught to unipolarize themselves. They've been taught to buy into one perspective only in order to set up this dualistic world. Okay? Dualism, by the way, is not being able to, it's not to do with holding two differing opinions about something. Okay? That's not what it is. It's about becoming unipolarized. It's about setting up a situation in which things are unipolarized. Whether it's your perceptions, whether it's the political dynamics of a country, whether it's the religious dynamics of a country, the ethos in a country, whatever it might be. It's all about setting that up to be that way. It's not about holding two different ideas as being perhaps extremes on two different ends, okay, of a continuum. That doesn't make the things opposite to each other, incidentally. Okay? It just makes them two binary choices amid a sea of choices, amid a sea of probabilities or possibilities. Okay? That's what it's fundamentally all about. And the more you're able to understand that, okay, the more you're able to take two seemingly opposite ideas and see the interconnectedness between them, the less you're going to find yourself being dualistic or unipolarized in your mind. And what that leads to, surprisingly enough, is unification. Incidentally, one other thing I'll say before I leave this video is that unification is not the same thing as the Hegelian synthesis. Okay? People might not understand that as well, because, see, a lot of Western philosophy, not the great works, but the nonsensical stuff that's been put out there by, say, for example, postmodernism or these other forms of thinking, materialism, rationalism. There are mistakes in all of these philosophies, extreme ones, right? And what they do is they actually prevent you from being able to understand things properly. Like the whole Hegelian dialectic, the idea behind that is to take a thesis and then an antithesis and then merge the two things together to create a synthesis. What happens if you're taking two really bad ideas and synthesizing them? Then you'll just end up with a synthesis of really bad ideas. Okay? So that's the Hegelian concept of synthesis. But that is not what being unified in your consciousness is all about, incidentally. That's got bugger all to do with it. Okay? Unification involves being able to perceive properly through conscious understanding and expression. Alright? It's got nothing to do with joining up bad ideas. If you find yourself trying to do that, you're not trying to unify your consciousness, you're actually creating more problems for yourself. Okay? And you also probably shouldn't try and join together good ideas either. Folks will get a little bit surprised by that. Okay? They'll say, what do you mean? Surely good ideas should be joined together. No. Let the good idea stand on its own merits, and let it flow. Okay, this is the great mistake that constantly is made out there. Everybody wants to force together one idea or another idea, or one group and another group. So if you're trying to force things together, it won't work. Alright, you have to let things flow naturally. This is the great mistake that's made on a macro level when it comes to lofty ideas of multiculturalism. Okay? Because there's this idea that the state or the government or people who are in perceived positions of power can dictate the actions of the populace or force the actions of the populace. And that type of force is actually a form of violence that they're doing on their own citizenry. Okay, they're not allowing things to flow naturally, because if that's allowed to happen, then peoples naturally of different nationalities or different ethnicities will interact. Okay, they do interact. They have done for thousands of years. Okay, this is not new that people of differing backgrounds interact with one another. It happens as a natural consequence. It flows naturally. Okay, but if you start to impose that ideal on people, you're actually committing an act of violence against them. You're damaging them very seriously. You know? So that's not a true sense of unification. Unification comes from, as I say, conscious understanding. People have to have the freedom of choice to choose. To choose what they want to make come into existence. Okay, to look at a realm of possibilities and say, well, that's what I'd like to do. Or that's not what I'd like to do. But to be able to do that consciously, instead of being in an unconscious fog all the time. But this is fundamentally, as I say, what yoga is all about. It's not only about that, but that's the end result of it. There are layers of metaphysical meaning and questioning within the various traditions, whether it's Ashtanga yoga, whether it's any other branch of, as I say, yogic practice. You see this in each of these. There are fundamental questions that are asked about who you are, why you are, where you are, how you are. Okay? What is your place in this world? How do you know that you actually are? But as I say, the popularized versions of yoga have taken that away, right? They've, like happens with any true form of spiritualism, when it's perceived through the lens of dualism and materialism, it just strips away the underpinnings of a very complex system that allows you to better understand your behaviors, your actions, your thoughts, which are not your own, strangely enough, and also to understand what that which we call the spirit is. That life force. Where does it come from? And like I said in the last video, it doesn't come from anywhere. It doesn't have to. It doesn't go anywhere, and it doesn't come from anywhere. Okay? Your essence, and actually your consciousness, and this will not make sense to a whole lot of people, alright? And I don't blame them for not understanding what I'm about to say, unless they've looked at it deeply. Your consciousness is not in this dimension. Okay? It is not here. If you open your body up, if you die and somebody performs an autopsy, or if you're living, or if we were to use all kinds of machinery to look inside you, we would not find your consciousness, because it does not reside in any of these dimensions of width, depth, height, space, time, nothing. Okay? It does not reside there at all. In fact, if I was to tell you, okay, and this will, just to give you a taste of this, if I was to tell you that you are still connected and part of the source at the root, that would probably either scare you or make you freak out. Okay? This physical existence, this body that you occupy, this vessel, is merely a means through which the source of all things expresses itself. You're an expression. Okay? You're not quite what you think you are. And this is a grave mistake, that we don't teach this to people anymore. Like I said once before, in the West there were ancient traditions that did teach this. Just like there were in India, just like there were in China, just like there were in certain regions in which the shamanic practices worked. Okay? Just like the Native Americans. In the past, these things were common knowledge. But over time, what has happened is that because of a misunderstanding in the minds of certain groups of people, they sought to separate themselves from all of nature and all of creation. Okay? And because they sought to separate themselves from all of nature and all of creation to such a degree that they would end up ruling over it all, they did not understand that they too were ultimately going to be subject to the laws of nature. That they too are an expression of the source. Okay? To simplify what I'm talking about here, I guess, here's the thing. Either, and I'm going to put this into understandable language, colloquial language, okay? And I'm going to use words like God, alright? Because it's the only way a lot of people will understand. If you have that kind of worldview that you are separate from all else, what happens is that automatically, over time, you develop a very dangerous ethos. And that is that the will of all else should be under your will. Okay? And this is too complex to go into in this video. But I've tried to cover it a little bit here and there over the last 2 years. Either you believe that man is under the laws of nature, that is to say, under God, okay, in the physical domain, or you believe that you are God and that you are over all of nature. Okay? That you are superior. That's dangerous because you believe you're superior to the source which created you, which gave you a physical body, a vessel through which to transmit or communicate or to interact with everything that's out there in the world at large. Okay? And people who have that mindset, you know, they've been around for a while, but those are the folks that are still doing that today. Okay? That's what's going on. Before, these people existed as acolytes of Apep in Egypt. And then they branched off into the temple of Set. And before all of that in Egypt, they were around, kicking around in Babylonia, Mesopotamia, with branches of different types of cults, which were all about manipulating human consciousness so that it would never realize that it was directly connected to the source, so that they could rule over humanity. You know, it's a very twisted way of looking at life and creation, but many people do. And they ended up setting up these ideas of dualistic worldview instead of having a holistic worldview. But in order to combat that, they see the solution to it is not to go out there with placards and go marching and do this and do that. The solution to it is a change in consciousness. You have to be here now. Okay? You have to do that. That's yoga. Bringing yourself into conscious being in each moment. Okay? Be conscious. At least in the moments in which you're awake. You know? But that's the solution to the problem. You actually have to make yourself be aware of their trickery. You have to make yourself aware of how to not allow their point of view to determine your point of view. Because too many people, they'll talk about being spiritually aware or spiritually awake, and I've addressed this before a little, but they don't know the first thing about it. They're still using the same language, the same tools as the manipulators, thus showing that they are still under the very same mind control. Alright? They haven't escaped anything. They've just gone from one form of imprisonment to another form of imprisonment. But the truly conscious being doesn't do that. The truly unified being doesn't do that. Okay, the unified being does not get pulled in every single direction that the rest of society is being herded in. That's yoga. The ability to remain one with yourself. That's yoga. The ability to know that you are one with all else. That is yoga in a nutshell. Anyway, I'm going to leave this video here, but I want to thank you very much for watching, and may you all have a prosperous day ahead of you, and God bless you, every single one of you. Take good care. Bye-bye.